Carl Gustav Jung, 1875 to 1961. Freud once considered Carl Jung to be his surrogate son and heir to the psychoanalytic movement, calling him, quote, my successor and crown prince, end quote. After their friendship disintegrated in 1914, Jung developed his analytical psychology, which opposed most of Freud's work. Again, analytical psychology is Jung's theory of personality. Concerning Jung's life, Jung grew up in a small village in northern Switzerland and near the famous Rhine Falls. By his own account, his childhood was lonely, isolated, and unhappy. Jung said this in 1961. His father was a clergyman who had apparently lost his faith. He was moody, irritable, and given to loud rages. A biographer of Jung once said, quote, Carl heard everything as his father's anger resonated throughout the house, end quote. His mother suffered from emotional disorders. Her behavior was erratic, and she would change in an instant from a happy housewife to a mumbling, incoherent demon. Another biographer suggested that the, quote, whole maternal side of the family appeared to be tainted with insanity, end quote. Jung learned at an early age not to trust or confide in either parent, and by extension, not to trust the rest of the world, not either. He turned away from the conscious world of reason and ventured inward to the world of his dreams, visions, and fantasies, the world of his unconscious. This became his guide in childhood and remained so throughout his adult life. More than 50 years later, a neighbor of the Jung family recalled the first time he had met the boy Carl, and he wrote, quote, I had never come across such an asocial monster before, end quote. At critical times, Jung resolved problems and made decisions based on what his unconscious told him through his dreams. When he was ready to enter college, his major field was revealed in a dream. He saw himself unearthing bones of prehistoric animals deep beneath the Earth's surface. He interpreted this to mean he should study nature and science. A memory from age 3, when he dreamed he was in an underground cavern, foretold his future study of personality. Jung would focus on the unconscious forces that lie beneath the surface of the mind. Jung attended the University of Basel, Switzerland, and graduated in 1900 with a medical degree. He was interested in psychiatry, and his first professional appointment was at a mental hospital in Zurich. The director was Eugen Buehler, a psychiatrist noted for work on schizophrenia. In 1905, Jung was appointed lecturer in psychiatry at the University of Zurich. Several years later, after marrying the second wealthiest heiress in all of Switzerland, he was able to resign from the university to devote full time to writing, research, and private practice. Jung and his wife maintained a highly formal, rigid approach to raising their 3 daughters. They had limited physical contact with them and insisted that there be no kissing and hugging of the children. When they said hello or goodbye, they shook hands, if they touched at all. This is much similar to John Watson's raising of his children. In his work with patients, Jung did not adopt Freud's habit of asking them to lie on a couch. He said he had no wish to put his patients to bed. Jung and the patient sat opposite each other in comfortable chairs. Occasionally, he held therapy sessions aboard his sailboat, happily racing across the lake in a high wind. Sometimes he sang to his patients. At other times, he was deliberately rude. When one patient appeared at the appointed time, Jung said, quote, oh no, I can't stand the sight of another one. Just go home and cure yourself today, end quote. Jung became interested in Freud's work in the year 1900 when he read The Interpretation of Dreams, which he considered to be a masterpiece. By 1906, the two men had begun to correspond, and a year later, Jung traveled to Vienna to visit Freud. Their first meeting lasted 13 hours, an exciting beginning for what would become an intimate father-son relationship, since Freud was almost 20 years older than Jung. Their closeness may have contained elements of the Oedipus complex, as proposed by Freud in his psychoanalytic theory, with the inevitable desire of the son to destroy the father. Another complicating factor that may have doomed the relationship was a sexual experience Jung reported having at age 18. A family friend whom Jung had seen as a father figure had made unwanted sexual advances. Jung was repelled and immediately ended that relationship. Years later, when Freud attempted to ensure that Jung would carry on the psychoanalytic movement as Freud envisioned it, Jung rebelled against the burden, perhaps feeling once again that an older man was trying to dominate him. In both instances, Jung was disappointed in his chosen father figure. Perhaps because of the earlier incident, he was unable to sustain the close emotional relationship that Freud needed. Unlike most of Freud's psychoanalytic disciples, Jung had already established a professional reputation of his own before becoming associated with Freud. He was the best known of the early converts to psychoanalysis, and as a result, he may have been less impressionable and suggestible than younger analysts who joined Freud's psychoanalytic family, many of whom were still in medical school or graduate school and unsure of their professional identity. Although for a time Jung identified himself as a disciple of Freud's, he was never an uncritical one. Early in their relationship, he tried to suppress his doubts and objections. While writing The Psychology of the Unconscious, published in 1912, he reported that he was troubled, realizing that when the book was published, publicly setting forth his own position that differed significantly from orthodox psychoanalysis, it would damage his standing with Freud. For months, Jung was unable to proceed with the project, so disturbed was he about Freud's potential reaction. Of course, he did eventually publish, and the inevitable occurred. In 1911, at Freud's insistence and despite opposition from the Viennese members, Jung became the first president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. Freud believed that anti-Semitism would impede the growth of psychoanalysis if the group's president were Jewish. The Viennese analysts, almost all whom were Jewish, resented and distrusted the Swiss-born Jung, who so obviously was Freud's favorite. They not only had seniority in the movement, but also believed that Jung held anti-Semitic views. Shortly thereafter, Jung's friendship with Freud began to show signs of strain, and by the year 1912, they ended their personal correspondence. In 1914, Jung resigned and withdrew from the association. When Jung was 38 years old, he was stricken with intense emotional problems that persisted for the next 3 years. Freud had experienced a similar period of turmoil at the same age of life. Believing he was going insane, Jung felt unable to do any intellectual work or even read a scientific book. He considered suicide and kept a gun next to his bed, quote, in case he felt he had passed beyond the point of no return, end quote. During those years of his late 30s, Jung was haunted by visions of a bloody apocalypse and widespread carnage and desolation. He meticulously recorded these dreams in calligraphy and elaborated drawings in some 200 pages of what has become known as the Red Book. This journal was kept secret in a Swiss bank vault and was not published until 2009, nearly 50 years after his death. Of course, I've read the Red Book. I bought it when it was first printed for public reading. But in any case, some of his dreams were intensely personal, though no less frightening. In one set of dreams, Jung travels the land of the dead, falls in love with the woman he later realizes is his sister, gets squeezed by a giant serpent, and eats the liver of a little child. It is no wonder that he felt troubled. Of course, also if you have studied Jung, he also he fought during the Great War, and this greatly troubled him as well. So Jung's visions came to him in an endless stream, which he described as if rocks were tumbling down on his head. I often had to cling to the table, he said, so as not to fall apart. It is interesting, however, that during this crisis, Jung did not stop treating his patients. And obviously, his war experiences and seeing the great calamities of the World War definitely left an impression and impact on Jung's psyche. But in any case, he resolved his dilemma the same way Freud did, by confronting his unconscious mind. Although he did not analyze his dreams systematically as Freud had done, Jung followed his unconscious impulses as revealed in dreams and fantasies. As with Freud, this period became a time of immense creativity for Jung and led him to formulate his personality theory. He wrote, quote, "The years when I was pursuing my inner images were the most important in my life. In them, everything essential was decided. And Jung wrote that in 1961. He concluded, based on this experience, that the most important stage in personality development was not childhood, as Freud believed, but middle age, the time of his own crisis. Of course, even though Jung's personal crisis was apparently resolved by his confrontation with his unconscious, some aspects of his behavior remained unusual, to say the least. Each morning he spoke to his kitchen utensils. "Greetings to you," he would say to the frying pans, or "Good morning to you," to the coffee pot. He hid large amounts of cash inside books and stuffed in jars that he buried in the garden, and then forgot the secret codes he had devised to remind him where the jars were hidden. Despite such odd behaviors, Jung remained highly productive and continued to write and develop his system for most of his 86 years. Jung's life experiences undoubtedly influenced his analytical psychology. We saw that his acceptance of the forces of his own unconscious foretold his professional interests. Autobiographical evidence is also strong with regard to his views on sex. Jung's theory had no place for an Oedipus complex. It simply was not relevant to his childhood. He thought his mother was fat and unattractive, and he never understood Freud's insistence that little boys develop sexual longings for their mothers. Jung developed no adult insecurities, inhibitions, or anxieties about sex as Freud did. Further, Jung made no attempt to limit his sexual activities as Freud had. Jung preferred the company of women to men and surrounded himself with adoring female patients and disciples. When they inevitably developed a crush, he did not hesitate to begin a sexual liaison, some of which lasted for years. He warned his female disciples that sooner or later they would fall in love with him. An analysis of the ill-fated relationship between Freud and Jung noted, to Jung, who freely and frequently satisfied his sexual needs, sex played a minimal role in human motivation. To Freud, beset by frustrations and anxious about his thwarted desires, sex played the central role. As a child, Jung isolated himself from the company of other children, preferring a solitary existence. This choice is reflected in his theory, in its focus on inner growth instead of social relationships. In contrast, Freud's theory is more concerned with interpersonal relationships. Freud did not have an isolated and introverted childhood. Another point of difference between Jung's analytical psychology and Freud's psychoanalysis concerns libido. Whereas Freud defined libido largely in sexual terms, Jung regarded it as a generalized life energy of which sex was only a part. For Jung, basic libidinal energy expressed itself in growth, reproduction, and other activities, depending on what was crucial for an individual at any given time. Still, another difference between the work of Jung and Freud is the direction of the forces that affect personality. Freud described people as victims of childhood events. In contrast, Jung believed we are shaped not only by the past, but also by our goals, hopes, and aspirations for the future. To Jung, personality was not fully determined by experiences during the first 5 years of childhood, but could be changed throughout one's lifetime. Also, Jung attempted to probe more deeply than Freud into the unconscious mind. He added a new dimension, the collective unconscious, which he described as the inherited experiences of the human species and their animal ancestors. And again, we'll get into the collective unconscious. So, the collective unconscious, Jung described 2 levels of the conscious mind. Beneath our conscious awareness is the personal unconscious, which contains memories, impulses, wishes, faint perceptions, and other experiences in a person's life that have been suppressed or forgotten. This level of unconsciousness is not very deep. Incidents from the personal unconscious can easily be recalled to conscious awareness. Again, personal unconscious is the reservoir of material that once was conscious but has been forgotten or is suppressed. The experiences in the personal unconscious are grouped into complexes, which are patterns of emotions and memories with common themes. A person will manifest a complex by a preoccupation with some idea, such as power and inferiority, that then influences his or her behavior. Thus, a complex is essentially a smaller personality within the total personality. At a level below the personal unconscious is what Jung called the collective unconscious, unknown to the individual. It does contain the accumulated experiences of all previous generations, including our animal ancestors. These universal evolutionary experiences form the basis of personality. Remember that the experiences within the collective unconscious are unconscious. We are not aware of them, nor do we remember or have images of them as we do of experiences within the personal unconscious. So the collective unconscious is the deepest level of the psyche. It contains inherited experiences of human and the pre-human species as primates. So, inherited tendencies called archetypes within the collective unconscious are innate determinants of mental life that dispose a person to behave not unlike ancestors who found themselves in similar situations. We typically experience archetypes in the form of emotions associated with significant life events such as birth, adolescence, marriage, and death, or with reactions to extreme danger. Jung referred to archetypes as the gods of the unconscious. Archetypes are inherited tendencies within the collective unconscious that dispose a person to behave similarly to ancestors who confronted similar situations. When Jung invented the mythical and artistic creations of ancient civilizations, he discovered common archetypal symbols, even in cultures so widely separated in time and place that there was no possibility of direct influence. He also found what he considered traces of these symbols in dreams reported by his own patients. All this material supported his concept of the collective unconscious. The archetypes that occur most frequently and that are the most important in shaping our personality are the persona, the anima and animus, the shadow, and the self. The persona is the mask each of us wears when we come into contact with other people. The mask represents us as we want to appear to society, such as a persona may not correspond to an individual's true personality. The notion of the persona is similar to the concept of role-playing, in which we act in ways we think other people expect us to act in different situations. The anima and the animus archetypes reflect the idea that each person exhibits some of the characteristics of the opposite sex. The anima refers to feminine characteristics in man. The animus denotes masculine characteristics in the woman. As with other archetypes, these arise from the primitive past of the human species as primate apes when men and women adopted behavioral and emotional tendencies of the opposite sex. Our darker self, represented by the shadow archetype, is the animalistic part of personality. Jung considered it to be inherited from lower forms of life. The shadow contains immoral, passionate, and unacceptable desires and activities. The shadow urges us to do things we ordinarily would not allow ourselves to do. Once having done them, though, we are likely to insist that something came over us and forced us to act that way. That something is the shadow, the primitive part of our nature. There is also a positive side to the shadow, however, which serves as a wellspring for spontaneity, creativity, insight, and deep emotion, all of which are necessary for complete human development. Jung considered the self to be the most important archetype of them all. It serves to integrate and balance all aspects of the unconscious and provides the personality with unity, stability, direction, and focus. Jung likened it to a drive toward self-actualization, by which he meant harmony, completeness, and the full development of our abilities. However, he believed that self-actualization could not be attained until middle age, between the age of 30 and 40. Years he believed were crucial to personality development. Jung argued that middle age is a natural time of transition when the personality undergoes necessary and beneficial changes. Here we see a crucial autobiographical element in Jung's theory. His middle years were when he achieved self-integration following the resolution of his neurotic crisis. To Jung, the significant stage in personality development was not childhood, as in Freud's life and system, but one's 30s and 40s, the time of his own personal change. And obviously, one needs to note here that Jung continuously suffered from psychosis. So, you may be already familiar with the general concept of introversion and extroversion. Jung believed that the extrovert directs libido, or life energy, outside the self to external events and people. This type of person is strongly influenced by forces in the environment and is sociable and self-confident in a variety of situations. In contrast, the libido of the introvert is directly inward. Such a person is contemplative introspective, and resistant to external influences. The introvert is likely to be less confident than the extrovert in dealing with other people and situations. These opposing attitudes exist in all of us to some degree or another, but one attitude is usually stronger than the other. No one is a complete extrovert or an introvert. The dominant attitude at any given time can be determined by circumstances. Frequently, introverted people can become sociable and outgoing in situations that hold their interest. In Jung's theory, personality, or psychological types, personality differences are expressed not only by the attitudes of introversion or extroversion on a spectrum of extroversion, but also through our four functions: thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuiting. These functions are ways in which we orient ourselves to both the objective external world and our subjective internal world. Thinking is a conceptual process that provides meaning and understanding. Feeling is a subjective process of weighing and valuing. Sensing is the conscious perception of physical objects. And intuiting involves perceiving in an unconscious way. Jung labeled thinking and feeling as rational modes of responding because they involve the cognitive processes of reason and judgment. Sensing and intuiting are considered non-rational because they do not involve the use of reason. Within each pair of functions, only one is dominant at a given time. The dominant functions combine with the dominant attitude of extroversion or introversion to produce the 8 psychological types, such as the extroverted thinking type or the introverted intuiting type. Jung's ideas have influenced such diverse fields as religion, history, art, and literature. Historians, theologians, and writers have acknowledged him as a source of inspiration. However, scientific psychology in general has ignored much of analytical psychology. Jung's disdain for traditional scientific methods repels many experimental psychologists, for whom Jung's mystical, religion-based theories hold even less appeal than Freud's. Although also the criticisms we noted about supporting evidence for Freudian psychoanalysis also apply to Jung's work. Jung, too, relied on clinical observation and interpretation rather than on controlled laboratory investigation. However, some of Jung's work has a lasting and continuing influence on psychology. The word association test, for example, which Jung developed in the early 1900s, is now a standard laboratory and clinical tool in psychology. Jung's version of the word association test used a list of 100 stimulus words that he believed were capable of eliciting emotions. He measured the time it took for a patient to respond to each word, as well as the person's physiological reactions to determine the emotional intensity of the stimulus words. Jung's 8 psychological types have stimulated considerable research as well. Noteworthy is the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, a personality test that is used and designed to measure the psychological types. Constructed in the 1920s by Catherine Briggs and Isabel Briggs Myers, the test is widely used for research and applied purposes, especially employee selection and counseling. The introversion-extroversion formulation inspired English psychologist Hans Eysenck to develop the Maudsley Personality Inventory, which is a test to measure the 2 of Jung's attitudes. Research using these tests has provided empirical support for these concepts and demonstrated that at least some Jungian notions are amenable to experimental testing. Indeed, Jung's concepts of introversion and extroversion are widely accepted in psychology today. As with Freud's work, however, broader aspects of Jung's theories such as complexes, archetypes, and the collective unconscious resist attempts at scientific validation. So, basically, concepts that resist attempts at scientific validation are Jung's theories such as complexes, the archetypes, and the collective unconscious. The concept of self-actualization anticipated the work of Abraham Maslow and the humanistic psychologists. The notion of a midlife crisis has been embraced by Maslow and others and is accepted by many as a necessary stage of personality development. Its existence is supported by considerable research. Formal training in Jungian analysis is available in a number of cities in Europe and the United States, such as New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and Los Angeles. The Society of Analytical Psychology, which was founded in 1946, publishes the Journal of Analytical Psychology. We noted that Freud was influenced by the mechanistic and positivistic outlook of 19th century science. Toward the end of that century, new disciplines were suggesting other ways to study human nature, ways that exceeded the boundaries of biology and physics. Research in anthropology, sociology, and social psychology supported the proposition that people are products of social forces and institutions, and therefore should be studied in social rather than strictly biological terms. As anthropologists publicized their studies of various cultures, it became clear that some of the neurotic symptoms and taboos Freud described were not universal, as he had actually proposed. For example, not all cultures had prohibitions against incest. In addition, sociologists and social psychologists had learned that much human behavior stems from social conditioning rather than from actions taken to satisfy biological needs. Thus, the spirit of the times was calling for a revised conception of human nature, but Freud, to the dismay of some of his followers, clung to biological determinants of personality, when he should have been clinging to that of social conventionality and social conditioning. Younger analysts, less constrained by tradition, drifted away from orthodox psychoanalysis to reshape Freudian theory in line with the then current social science thought. Their focus that personality is more a product of environment than of biological instincts was compatible with American culture and thought at the time and offered a more optimistic scenario than Freud's deterministic position. Alfred Adler and Karen Horney were two major dissenters who believed that human behavior is determined not by biological forces, but by the interpersonal relationships to which the person is exposed, particularly in childhood.